The sun blazed over the pristine, crystal-clear pool in the heart of an upscale neighborhood. Lush palm trees swayed in the soft breeze, casting moving shadows over the lounging area. The air smelled of chlorine, sunscreen, and wealth, an atmosphere of exclusivity, of status, of an unspoken hierarchy that had ruled this place for years. It was supposed to be a haven, a place to unwind, to escape from the stress of the world. But for one woman, this afternoon would be anything but peaceful. She had just settled into her chair, her sunglasses reflecting the sparkling water as she sipped on her drink. A rare moment of stillness, a brief respite from the weight of her demanding career. That peace, however, was short-lived. A sharp, condescending voice sliced through the tranquility. "What are you doing here?" The tone was laced with immediate hostility, a barely veiled accusation that rang louder than the words themselves. She turned her head slowly, lifting her sunglasses slightly to get a proper look at the speaker. A white woman, impeccably dressed, a slight smirk of arrogance curling her lips. "Excuse me." "You heard me," the woman scoffed, placing a manicured hand on her hip. "This is a private pool, and I don't recognize you. Are you visiting someone?" The question was drenched in suspicion, but it wasn't a question at all. It was an assumption. A statement. A declaration that she did not belong. "I live here." Her voice was calm, measured. She had seen this before. Felt this before. The immediate questioning, the disbelief, the quiet demand to explain herself in spaces where others were simply accepted. The white woman's expression barely changed. She scanned her up and down, lips pursed, as if assessing the validity of her words. "That's funny," she said, letting out a dry, humorless laugh. "I know all my neighbors. And I don't recall seeing you before." "Well, now you have." Silence stretched between them. The white woman didn't move. Her eyes flickered with something, annoyance. Frustration. A desperate need to prove her dominance in this space. Then, her fingers curled around her phone. "I think I'll just call security," she said, voice dripping with satisfaction. "You can't be too careful these days. People wander into places they don't belong all the time." For a brief moment, the words hung heavy in the air, suffocating. The woman in the chair let out a slow breath, steadying herself. Her hands clenched around her drink, the condensation cool against her skin. She had two choices. She could let it go. Ignore it. Walk away, as she had done so many times before, swallowing the bitter taste of humiliation just to keep the peace. Or, no. Not this time. She sat up, placed her drink carefully on the side table, and met the woman's gaze head-on. "You should think very carefully before you make that call." The white woman's eyes flashed, caught off guard by the sudden shift in tone. "Is that a threat?" "It's a warning." But the woman was already dialing, turning her back slightly, as if the conversation was beneath her now. "Yes, hi, this is Karen from the gated community. I'd like to report someone trespassing at the pool. She's refusing to leave." The words landed like a slap. A quiet, burning anger coiled in the woman's stomach. She watched as Karen spoke, her voice sugary sweet, playing the role of the innocent, concerned citizen. And she knew exactly what would happen next. She had seen it play out 1,000 times before, in different places, with different people. The arrival of security. The questioning. The demand for proof. The humiliation of having to justify her presence in her own home. But this time, the script would change. The security guard arrived within minutes, his uniform crisp, his stance authoritative. Karen turned to him with an air of smug victory. "There she is," she gestured dismissively. "I told her to leave, but she's refusing. I don't think she lives here." The guard turned to face the accused. And his expression shifted instantly. "Ma'am," he said, straightening up with a look of recognition, of respect. "Is there a problem?" Karen blinked. Wait. What? What do you mean? She stammered, a flicker of confusion flashing across her face. She's trespassing. She doesn't live here. The guard's jaw tightened. He glanced at the black woman, then back at Karen. Actually, she does, he said firmly. And not only does she live here, she owns one of the most expensive properties in this entire community. Silence. Karen's face paled. The black woman leaned forward, her expression unreadable. You were saying. Karen's lips parted, but no words came out. The security guard turned to her, his demeanor shifting into something colder, more authoritative. Ma'am, do you realize that falsely reporting someone to security based on race is against the community's anti-discrimination policy? Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. But I didn't, but she did. And everyone knew it. The security guard exhaled, shaking his head. I'm going to have to file an incident report. And I strongly advise you to apologize before this escalates. Karen's throat tightened. Apologize? To her? She turned back to the black woman, expecting, what? Pity? Understanding? Some form of leniency? But there was none. Only a quiet, unshakable confidence. Karen's world was tilting. And it was only the beginning. Because the woman she had just tried to humiliate. She wasn't just another resident. She wasn't just another neighbor. She was one of the most powerful attorneys in the entire country. And within days, Karen would regret this moment more than anything she had ever done. Because when justice comes knocking, there is no escape. What happened next? Well, let's just say the entire neighborhood would never forget the day Karen learned exactly what it means when karma strikes back. Before we dive into this powerful story, I want to take a moment to speak directly to our black viewers. Here at Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against racism in any form. We believe in justice, respect, and equality for all. No one should ever have to face discrimination for simply existing, and this story is a reminder that karma has a way of setting things right. So, sit back and enjoy this intense, emotional, and satisfying story. And if you believe in powerful stories with real justice, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button. Now, let's get into it. The sun bathed the neighborhood in a golden glow, reflecting off the polished glass windows of the luxury homes that lined the gated community. This was a place of privilege, where status meant everything, and appearances mattered more than substance. The kind of neighborhood where people whispered behind manicured hedges, where every lawn was immaculately trimmed, and the streets were silent except for the occasional sound of an expensive car rolling by. It was the kind of place where wealth wasn't just an advantage, it was the expectation. The air was thick with an unspoken code, people here belonged. And if you didn't fit the mold, you were out of place. For Olivia Carter, this wasn't just home, it was a statement. A testament to everything she had fought for, worked for, and achieved. From the outside, her house blended seamlessly with the others, modern, sleek, with expansive glass windows and a view of the private lake behind it. But inside, it was different. It was lived in, warm, filled with the remnants of a life built on resilience. Framed diplomas lined the walls of her study, Harvard Law School, Yale undergrad. Awards from major cases she had won, photos of her standing beside some of the most influential people in the country. She was one of the top defense attorneys in the nation, a name that carried weight in every courtroom she entered. A woman who had shattered ceilings and broken barriers to stand where she stood today. But in places like these, none of that mattered. To the people who had lived in this community for years, who had inherited their wealth rather than earned it, Olivia's presence was an anomaly. A disruption in their carefully curated reality. They watched her, analyzed her, spoke in hushed voices when she walked by. She could feel it. The looks. The assumptions. The silent questions that followed her whenever she entered a shared space. How did she get in here? Did she marry into money? Did she win the lottery? The idea that she had built her life through sheer determination and brilliance didn't fit their narrative. And because of that, she was treated with a politeness that was too sharp around the edges, too forced to be real. Then there was Karen Whitmore. The self-proclaimed queen of the neighborhood. The kind of woman who saw herself as the gatekeeper of their perfect community, always making sure things stayed exactly as they were. She had been one of the first to move into the development when it was built nearly 15 years ago. A woman who thrived on control, who knew everyone's business, who was part of every homeowners association meeting, making sure every rule, especially the unspoken ones, was enforced. To Karen, Olivia was a disturbance. It wasn't just that Olivia was successful. It wasn't just that she lived in a house that rivaled Karen's in both size and luxury. It was who Olivia was. A woman who had earned her place in a world where Karen had merely been handed hers. Karen had been watching her from the moment she moved in. The expensive cars pulling up to her driveway, the well-dressed men and women who came in and out of her house for meetings, the way Olivia carried herself with an air of quiet authority that Karen couldn't stand. There was a confidence in her that Karen resented. A power that went beyond money. She would never admit it, but deep down, Karen was threatened. And that's why, when she saw Olivia at the community pool, sitting comfortably in one of the lounge chairs, reading a book with the ease of someone who belonged, something inside her snapped. Karen was with two other women, Meredith and Lisa, her closest friends, women who shared her worldview, who reinforced her authority in the community. They had been talking about trivial things, renovations, upcoming charity galas, their children's private school drama, when Karen noticed Olivia. She frowned, tilting her sunglasses down slightly to get a better look. "Since when do they use our pool?" she muttered, just loud enough for her friends to hear. Lisa raised an eyebrow, following Karen's gaze. "She lives here," Meredith said, her voice neutral, but Karen could hear the hesitation in it. "Since when?" Karen scoffed. "I don't recall seeing her at any of the neighborhood events." "Maybe she's just private," Lisa offered. "Or maybe she doesn't belong here at all," Karen said, standing up. "I think I'll go find out." There was no hesitation as she marched over, her heels clicking against the pavement. Olivia was immersed in her book, unaware, or more likely, unbothered, by Karen's presence. But Karen wasn't the kind of person to be ignored. "Excuse me," she said sharply. "What are you doing here?" Olivia didn't react immediately. She turned a page in her book, her movements unhurried. Only then did she lift her eyes, her gaze meeting Karen's with a quiet, unreadable expression. "Relaxing," she said simply. Karen folded her arms, tilting her head. "This is a private pool." "I know," Olivia said, setting her book down. "I live here." Karen let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "Really?" "Yes," Olivia said, her tone still calm. "Really?" Karen's eyes flickered with something. A mixture of disbelief and indignation. It wasn't just that Olivia was here, it was that she wasn't explaining herself. Wasn't offering Karen the validation she wanted. "Well, I don't recall seeing you at any of the homeowners' meetings," Karen said. Olivia shrugged. "I'm a little busy." Karen's jaw tightened. A part of her knew she was making a mistake. That pushing this situation further could lead to something ugly. But she didn't care. "I think I'll call security," she said, her voice light, as if she were merely making a casual decision. "Just to confirm." And for the first time, Olivia's expression changed. It was subtle, but Karen caught it, the flicker of disgust. "You do that," Olivia said. And so Karen did. Within minutes, a security officer arrived. Karen turned to him, her voice coated in artificial concern. "There's been a situation," she said. "This woman is using the pool, and she says she lives here, but I don't recognize her." The security officer turned to Olivia. And immediately, his demeanor shifted. Ms. Carter, he said, his tone respectful. Is there a problem? Karen's stomach dropped. Ms. Carter? Why did he say it like that? And then, Olivia smiled. Not in amusement, not in kindness, but in knowing. No problem at all, she said smoothly. Karen here just seems a little confused about who I am. Karen's mouth went dry. Something was wrong. And she had no idea how bad it was about to get. Karen could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, but she refused to acknowledge it. The security officer's words echoed in her ears, repeating like a loop she couldn't turn off. She lives here. 3 words that shattered the illusion of control she had clung to so tightly. She wanted to argue, to insist that there had been a mistake, to demand proof beyond a name on some homeowner's list, but deep down, something inside her was cracking. She had been so sure, so certain, that she was right. That Olivia had been an intruder, someone who had somehow snuck in, someone who didn't belong. And now, standing there, staring at the unimpressed face of the security officer and the calm, knowing expression on Olivia's face, Karen felt the unfamiliar sting of something she was not accustomed to feeling, humiliation. It was a slow burn, one that started in her chest and crept up her throat, settling like a lump she couldn't swallow. She hated it. Hated the way it made her feel small, like she was the one who was being put in her place. She could feel the eyes of the other neighbors on her. Lisa and Meredith had fallen silent, their earlier murmurs of agreement vanishing into thin air. They were watching her, but not in the way she wanted them to. There was no admiration, no validation, no silent nods of approval that she had handled things correctly. No one was standing by her side, reinforcing the belief that she had done the right thing. Instead, there was doubt. There was discomfort. And worst of all, there was judgment. It was subtle, but she could feel it, like the slow turning of the tide before a storm. She didn't like this feeling. She wasn't used to it. She was the one who usually called people out, who pointed fingers, who exposed outsiders when they dared to step out of line. She was supposed to be right. But now, it was as if the ground beneath her feet had started to shift, and no matter how hard she tried to regain her balance, she was slipping. She needed to fix this, to regain control of the situation before it spiraled even further. Taking a deep breath, she squared her shoulders and forced herself to speak, her voice sharper now, laced with the kind of entitlement that had always gotten her what she wanted. She turned to the security officer, her arms crossing tightly over her chest as she pushed back against what she refused to accept. She needed him to see things her way. Needed him to question Olivia again, to demand proof beyond words, because this wasn't right. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. She had called security. She had made the complaint. That meant she was the victim here. Not the other way around. She scoffed, rolling her eyes in an exaggerated display of disbelief, trying to regain the upper hand. She questioned whether he was absolutely sure, emphasizing that she had lived in this community for years, longer than Olivia, longer than most of the other residents. She pointed out that she had never once seen Olivia at any of the neighborhood events, at any of the meetings, at any of the places where people like them were supposed to be seen. Because that was how things worked here. You didn't just exist in this community. You participated in it. You became part of the structure, woven into the fabric of the social hierarchy. And Olivia? She had never made the effort. She had never been one of them. And in Karen's mind, that was all the proof she needed that something wasn't right. But Olivia was done playing this game. She didn't flinch. She didn't waver. She simply met Karen's gaze with the kind of quiet, unshakable confidence that made Karen's skin crawl. And then, she smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. It wasn't a forgiving smile. It was the kind of smile that said, I see exactly what you're doing, and it's not going to work. It was a challenge, a test, a silent declaration that she was in control now, that she was no longer interested in entertaining Karen's delusions of authority. And Karen felt that shift like a slap to the face. And then Olivia spoke, her voice even, measured, but carrying an underlying weight that sent a ripple of unease through Karen's chest. She pointed out that this situation wasn't just a misunderstanding, wasn't just a small mistake. It was deliberate. Karen had called security on her not because she truly believed Olivia was trespassing, but because she had seen a black woman in a space she had mentally reserved for people like herself. And instead of questioning her own biases, instead of considering, even for a second, that Olivia had just as much right to be there as anyone else, she had immediately assumed the worst. And that assumption, that knee-jerk reaction, it was dangerous. Karen felt her face flush hot, embarrassment twisting into something uglier, something angrier. She opened her mouth to defend herself, to argue that it wasn't about that she had been genuinely concerned, that she had been just trying to keep the community safe. But before she could even get the words out, the security officer spoke again, cutting through whatever excuse she had been about to conjure. He confirmed Olivia's residency. Confirmed that she had been living in this neighborhood for 3 years. Confirmed that she was, in fact, one of the highest-paying homeowners in the entire community. And with every word, Karen felt the ground beneath her continue to crumble. She could feel the shift happening around her. The subtle yet unmistakable way the power was slipping through her fingers. The way the people who had once stood by her side were now stepping away. And she hated it. Hated the feeling of losing control. So she did what she always did when she felt herself being backed into a corner. She deflected. She forced out a laugh, pretending that this had all just been some innocent misunderstanding. She insisted that she had simply been looking out for the community, that she hadn't meant any harm. But her voice was thinner now, weaker, betraying the desperation creeping into her tone. She hated the way Olivia was looking at her. Hated the way Lisa and Meredith weren't rushing to validate her, to reassure her that she had done nothing wrong. Hated that for the first time in her life, she was standing on the other side of the accusations, being looked at as the one who had overstepped. And then, Olivia delivered the final blow. She told Karen that next time, before making assumptions, she might want to think twice. That there were consequences for actions like these. That people were watching, paying attention. That calling security on someone who actually belonged in this community could backfire in ways she hadn't even considered yet. And then, with one last pointed glance, Olivia gathered her things, completely unbothered, and walked away. Karen couldn't breathe. She felt the heat of everyone's stares burning into her skin. She felt the judgment. The shift. And she knew, in that moment, that she had lost. But she wasn't going to let it end here. Because the next morning, when she stepped outside, she saw something that set her entire world on fire. A sign. Right in front of her house. Bold. Unapologetic. No racists allowed in this neighborhood. Her entire body went rigid. Her hands clenched into fists. Her humiliation had just been made public. And she knew exactly who had done it. Her blood boiled. Her heart pounded. Her rage was uncontrollable. And so, without hesitation, she stormed inside, grabbed her phone, and called 911. She had no idea that the moment she made that call, her life was about to fall apart in ways she never could have imagined. The tension in Karen's chest coiled tighter as she gripped the phone, her fingers shaking, her breath coming in short, angry bursts. She could still see the sign in her mind, bold, humiliating, impossible to ignore, standing like a scarlet letter in front of her pristine, white picket-fenced house. The audacity of it. The sheer disrespect. Who the hell did Olivia think she was? Karen had lived in this neighborhood for over a decade. She had hosted fundraisers, led community events, built relationships with important people. This was her world, her domain. And now, in a single day, she had been reduced to a spectacle, a whispered name in conversations she wasn't invited to. She had never felt so powerless. She had never felt this out of control. The dispatcher's voice on the other end of the line was calm, detached, as if this were just another mundane call, but to Karen, this was anything but. Her voice rose with frustration as she explained what had happened, choosing her words carefully, painting herself as the victim. She didn't mention the security incident. She didn't mention the accusation, the questioning, the shame. Instead, she emphasized the trespassing, the defacing of her property, the threat. Because that's what it was, a threat. Someone was trying to silence her, to punish her for doing what was right, for trying to protect the neighborhood. She would not stand for this. The dispatcher asked for a description. Karen's jaw locked, her hand gripping the phone so tightly her knuckles turned white. She knew what they were really asking. Who did this? She could hear the hesitation in their voice, the way they waited for her to say it. She's black. Silence. Not long, but just enough for Karen to feel it. Just enough for her to realize that something wasn't right. Then the dispatcher spoke again, their tone neutral, but no longer disinterested. And do you have any evidence that this individual was the one who placed the sign? Karen blinked. Her lips parted, but no words came out immediately. Evidence? It's obvious, she snapped, her frustration boiling over. Who else would do something like this? A pause. Ma'am, I need to inform you that filing a false report is a criminal offense. Karen's stomach clenched. She knew where this was going. She had watched enough news, read enough stories about how things were changing. How the world was becoming so sensitive, so politically correct. She wasn't stupid. She knew how these things worked. And yet, she hadn't expected this. She doubled down, demanding that someone be sent immediately. That this was serious, that she felt unsafe in her own home. She needed them to understand that she was being targeted, that someone was trying to make an example out of her. The dispatcher finally relented, informing her that an officer would be sent to assess the situation, but their tone was different now. Detached. Unmoved. By the time Karen ended the call, her hands were shaking. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She should have felt victorious, but instead, there was a gnawing pit in her stomach that wouldn't settle. She turned toward the window, her eyes locking onto the sign again, that damn sign, and her rage returned with a vengeance. But then she saw something else. A car. Sleek. Black. Expensive. Pulling up in front of her house with the kind of deliberate ease that only belonged to someone who knew exactly what they were doing. And when the door opened, Karen felt her entire body go cold. Because there she was. Olivia. Dressed in a sharp navy blue pantsuit, stepping out of her car like she had just arrived at a business meeting rather than a war zone. Her posture was straight, her movements calculated, her expression unreadable behind her dark sunglasses. She was not here to play games. Karen barely had time to process what was happening before Olivia was walking up the pathway, her heels clicking against the pavement, each step feeling like a countdown to something inevitable. Karen swallowed hard, her breath quickening. She should have been prepared for this. She should have known Olivia wouldn't let this go, not after what happened at the pool, not after Karen tried to turn the situation against her again. But nothing, could have prepared her for the way Olivia took off her sunglasses, revealing eyes that held no patience, no forgiveness, no room for negotiation. And then Olivia spoke. Are you ready for this conversation, or should I give you a minute to come up with another lie? Karen's throat dried. She knew. She knew everything. For the first time in a very long time, Karen didn't have an answer. Olivia didn't wait for one. She took another step closer, her voice dropping to something quieter, sharper, infinitely more dangerous. She informed Karen that she had already spoken to the police. That she knew about the call. That she was fully aware of what Karen had tried to do, again. And Karen, trapped between her pride and the undeniable truth pressing in on her, floundered. She tried to defend herself, tried to say that she had every right to call because someone had trespassed on her property, because she had felt threatened, because this wasn't fair, but Olivia shut her down with a single look. And then, the real bomb dropped. Olivia reached into her bag and pulled out a folder. Thick. Heavy. Karen's stomach turned. "You might want to read this before the officers get here," Olivia said, handing it to her. Karen snatched it, flipping it open with shaky fingers. And as her eyes scanned the pages, the world tilted beneath her feet. Legal documents. Lawsuits. Filed against her. Defamation. False police reports. Harassment. Discrimination. Karen couldn't breathe. Her fingers trembled as she turned each page, her heart hammering in her chest. She tried to find something, anything, that would give her a way out. A loophole. A lifeline. But there was none. And then Olivia delivered the final blow. "You have two choices," she said smoothly, her voice as calm as ever. "You can go to court and watch your life crumble in real time, or, you can leave this neighborhood. Quietly. Permanently. And trust me when I say, Karen, you won't like what happens if you pick the first option." Karen's entire body went rigid. Her hands gripped the folder so tightly the edges bent. And for the first time, she understood. She had lost. And this time, there was no coming back from it. Karen stood frozen in place, her pulse hammering in her ears, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The folder in her hands felt impossibly heavy, the weight of its contents sinking into her bones, pressing down on her like an unbearable force. Her eyes skimmed over the legal jargon, words like defamation, false accusations, racial discrimination jumping off the pages like daggers aimed directly at her chest. This wasn't just a warning. It was a death sentence, at least, for the life she had meticulously crafted in this neighborhood. A life where she was the authority. Where she dictated who belonged and who didn't. And now, in the span of a single day, it had all come crashing down. She forced herself to look up, her eyes locking onto Olivia's, hoping to find even the smallest crack in her expression, something she could use, something that might indicate hesitation, doubt, weakness. But there was nothing. Just cold, unwavering certainty. Olivia wasn't bluffing. She wasn't making empty threats. She had already won. Karen swallowed, her mouth dry, her pride battling viciously with the fear clawing its way up her throat. "You can't be serious," she finally managed, though the words came out weaker than she intended, barely above a whisper. Olivia didn't blink. "Do I look like I'm joking?" Karen's grip on the folder tightened. This is ridiculous. You're blowing this way out of proportion. I didn't do anything illegal. I was just what?" Olivia interrupted, stepping forward, her voice still infuriatingly calm but carrying a weight that made Karen feel small. "Just protecting your little gated paradise from people you don't think belong. Just making sure that a black woman minding her own business was put back in her place. Just calling the police on me, twice, knowing exactly what could have happened if I weren't who I am." Olivia's voice dropped lower, sharper, a blade slicing through the thick, suffocating air between them. "Tell me, Karen, what do you think would have happened if I wasn't a lawyer? If I wasn't someone with power? What would have happened if it was just some regular black woman you decided to harass?" Karen's stomach twisted, her hands clammy, the heat of shame rising up her neck like a wildfire. I didn't think," "No," Olivia snapped, and for the first time, her control wavered, raw anger slipping through. "You didn't think. You never think. Because people like you never have to. You get to make accusations and call security and dial 911 and you never have to think about what comes next because it's never you who pays the price. But this time..." She took another step closer, her voice quiet, deadly. "This time, it's different." Karen's throat tightened. "I didn't mean for it to get this far," she muttered, the words spilling out before she could stop them. I just felt threatened. I thought, threatened? Olivia let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. By what? A woman reading a book by the pool. A sign that called you out for exactly what you are. What exactly was so threatening, Karen? Karen opened her mouth, but no words came. Because what could she say? What excuse could she give that wouldn't sound exactly as pathetic as it was? The silence stretched between them, suffocating. And then Olivia sighed, shaking her head again, this time with something almost resembling pity. You don't even realize it, do you? She said, her voice softer now, almost tired. You don't realize that this isn't just about what you did to me. This is about the pattern. The way you move through the world without ever having to face the consequences of your own ignorance, your own biases. You were so sure of yourself. So sure that no one would question you. That everyone would just believe you because they always do. Karen clenched her jaw, hating how exposed she felt, how naked Olivia's words made her. Olivia continued, her tone sharper now. But here's the thing, Karen. This isn't just about this neighborhood. This isn't just about a pool or a stupid sign or some homeowners association rules. This is about the fact that people like you, people who think like you, act like you, are the reason people like me have to be careful. Have to think twice before existing in spaces you've decided don't belong to us. And I'm tired of it. I'm tired of watching people like you get away with it over and over again. And I can promise you, you're not going to get away with it this time. Karen's heart pounded against her ribcage, panic clawing at her throat. So what now? You want to ruin my life? That's what this is. Her voice was high-pitched, desperate. You want to destroy me? Over what? Over a misunderstanding. Olivia's expression didn't change. No, Karen. You destroyed yourself. I'm just making sure you finally have to deal with the consequences. Karen's hands trembled. I can fix this, she said suddenly, the words coming out too fast, a desperate attempt to grab hold of something before she completely lost control. Maybe I can apologize, maybe we can come to some sort of agreement. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I don't want this to get out of hand. Olivia tilted her head, considering her. And then she exhaled, her voice quiet but firm. You still don't get it, do you? She said, almost sadly. It's already out of hand. It was the moment you opened your mouth and assumed that I didn't belong here. It was the moment you made that call. It was the moment you decided that your discomfort was more important than my dignity. Karen shook her head rapidly, her eyes darting toward the street, toward the houses lined up in perfect rows, toward the neighborhood she had ruled for so long. So what happens now? She whispered, her voice barely audible. Olivia stepped back, slipping her sunglasses back onto her face, her composure returning in full force. Now, she said smoothly, turning toward her car. Now, you leave. Karen's stomach twisted. I can't just, oh, but you can, Olivia interrupted, her voice cool. You will. Because the second this lawsuit hits, your name will be everywhere. And trust me, Karen, the people in this neighborhood? The people you've spent years impressing, making yourself the center of? They will turn on you the second it becomes inconvenient to be associated with you. The only thing this community values more than status is their own reputation. And you, Karen? You've just become a liability. Karen felt sick. Because she knew Olivia was right. She could already picture it, the whispers, the stares, the way people would start to distance themselves. How, overnight, she would become the problem. The one no one wanted to be seen with. The one people would talk about in hushed tones at dinner parties. She had spent years making herself untouchable. And in one day, Olivia had shattered it all. Olivia opened her car door, pausing only to say one final thing before she drove off, leaving Karen standing there, drowning in the cold, suffocating reality of her own downfall. Enjoy the time you have left here, Olivia said, her tone unreadable. Because it won't be long before this neighborhood makes it very clear. She slid into the driver's seat, giving Karen one last glance. You don't belong here. And then she was gone. And for the first time in her life, Karen knew exactly how it felt to be on the other side. Karen stood motionless in her driveway, Olivia's final words looping in her mind like a haunting echo. You don't belong here. The same words she had spent years wielding against others, the same unspoken sentiment she had built her sense of superiority upon, now turned against her with crushing finality. Her hands trembled at her sides, her breath uneven, her mind racing through every possible way out, every possible escape route from the reality that had just been forced upon her. But there was none. There was no way to erase what had happened, no way to undo the damage that had already begun to spread like a stain across the perfect image she had so carefully cultivated. She turned toward the street, toward the neatly manicured homes that stretched out before her in perfect symmetry, toward the pristine sidewalks where she had once walked with an air of entitlement, where she had once ruled. But now, something had changed. The neighborhood, which had always felt like an extension of her own power, now felt foreign, hostile, like it had already begun rejecting her. And she wasn't imagining it. A curtain in the house across the street shifted, someone watching her, just barely. Further down, a neighbor who had once greeted her with warm smiles now turned away, pretending to be engrossed in trimming their hedges. The subtle distance, the quiet withdrawal, it was happening already. She could feel it. The shift. The beginning of her social death. Her breathing quickened, panic swelling in her chest. She needed to fix this. There had to be a way to fix this. She could talk to Meredith, to Lisa, to the other women who had been her allies for years. She could explain, control the narrative, spin the story into something salvageable before it got any worse. She rushed inside, her heels clicking frantically against the marble flooring as she grabbed her phone, her fingers shaking as she dialed Lisa's number. It rang twice before going to voicemail. She tried Meredith next. Straight to voicemail. Her stomach tightened. No, no, no. This couldn't be happening. She tried a text instead. We need to talk. Urgent. She stared at the screen, waiting, willing the little typing bubble to appear. Nothing. Her hands clenched around the phone as she swallowed back the rising panic. They were abandoning her. She had seen it happen before, to others. To people who had made the mistake of getting caught on the wrong side of things. And now it was happening to her. She turned to the television, fumbling for the remote with stiff fingers. If she could just get ahead of this, if she could just see what people were saying, maybe she could control it. She flipped through the channels until she reached the local news station. And then her heart stopped. Because there it was. Her face. Plastered across the screen in crisp HD, next to the headline that made her entire body go cold, local woman faces backlash after false police report on black neighbor. Karen's breath hitched, her hands tightening on the remote as she watched the news anchor speak, her voice calm, professional, detached, as if this was just another routine story. But to Karen, it wasn't just another story. It was her downfall, broadcasted for the entire city to see. The footage cut to Olivia, standing in front of a courthouse, surrounded by reporters. She looked poised, controlled, her expression unreadable as she addressed the crowd. I have spent my entire career fighting against injustice, Olivia said smoothly, her voice carrying an air of effortless authority. But even I am not immune to the reality of racial profiling. The fact that I, a homeowner in this community, had to prove my right to exist in my own neighborhood is a stark reminder of the systemic issues that continue to plague this country. Karen's stomach twisted as the cameras panned to another reporter, her voice carrying the sharp edge of media scrutiny. Ms. Carter, what do you hope to accomplish with this lawsuit? Olivia didn't hesitate. Accountability, she said simply. And consequences. Karen slammed the remote onto the coffee table, her chest rising and falling rapidly. This couldn't be happening. This wasn't fair. She had spent years building her status, her reputation, and now, in less than 24 hours, Olivia had torn it all apart. Her phone buzzed. For a brief second, hope flickered inside her. Maybe it was Lisa. Maybe it was Meredith, maybe someone finally responding, ready to stand by her side. But when she glanced at the screen, her blood ran cold. It was her HOA president. She hesitated before answering, forcing her voice into something that resembled composure. "Hello." A pause. Then, the cool, clipped voice of James Holloway, the man who had controlled this community long before she had ever moved in. "Karen," he said smoothly. "We need to talk." Karen swallowed hard. Of course. I was actually going to reach out to you because, I'm going to stop you right there," James cut in, his voice carrying no patience, no warmth. "This situation you've created has become a problem. For the neighborhood. For the association. And quite frankly, for me." Karen felt the ground shift beneath her. I can explain," she stammered. "This is just a misunderstanding, the media is twisting things." The media isn't the problem," James interrupted, his tone icy. "The problem is that your face is now attached to a lawsuit, and your actions are reflecting poorly on the entire community. This is not the kind of attention we want. Do you understand what I'm saying?" Karen gripped the edge of the counter, her nails digging into the surface. "James, please," she pleaded, her voice shaking. "I've been a part of this neighborhood for years. I've done so much for this community, and that used to mean something," James said flatly. "But now, you're a liability." Karen's breath caught in her throat. What are you saying?" There was a pause, and then, the words that sealed her fate. "You need to move out, Karen. Immediately." The phone nearly slipped from her fingers. You can't do this," she whispered. "This is my home. You can't just." "The Homeowners Association has a very clear policy about maintaining the integrity of our community," James said smoothly. "And right now, you're damaging that integrity. Your best option is to sell, quietly, and disappear before this gets worse. Because I promise you, Karen, if you try to fight this, I will make sure you lose everything." Karen's entire body went numb. This was real. This was happening. She had spent years building her perfect life here. And now, in a matter of days, it was being ripped away from her. And there was nothing she could do to stop it. Karen's hands trembled as she set the phone down on the kitchen counter, her heartbeat so loud in her ears that she could barely hear anything else. The weight of James Holloway's words sat heavy in her chest, pressing down on her like an invisible force she couldn't escape. "You need to move out. Immediately." She had always seen herself as untouchable in this neighborhood, as someone who could dictate the rules, manipulate the social order to fit her needs. But now, the same system she had used to elevate herself was turning against her, dismantling everything she had built with a cold, surgical precision. And the worst part? There was nothing she could do about it. Her fingers dug into the counter as her body tensed with frustration, desperation, and a creeping sense of fear she had never truly felt before. This wasn't just about Olivia anymore. This wasn't just about some sign in her yard, or an argument by the pool. This was her life unraveling before her eyes. And it was happening so fast she couldn't even catch her breath. She turned toward the window, staring out at the quiet street, at the houses that had once felt like her domain, like a kingdom she had ruled over with effortless control. Now, those same houses felt alien, as if they had already rejected her, as if the entire community was standing just beyond her vision, whispering, judging, waiting for her to leave. She could almost hear their conversations, their hushed tones over dinner, their subtle avoidance at the country club, their carefully worded statements about how they had always thought Karen was a bit too much, how they had seen this coming, how it was only a matter of time before her behavior caught up to her. She swallowed, forcing down the lump in her throat as she grabbed her phone again, dialing Lisa's number for the second time that day. This time, it rang longer before going to voicemail, but there was no doubt, Lisa was ignoring her. Just like Meredith. Just like everyone else. She tried a text. "Lisa, please. I need to talk. I need to fix this." She watched the screen, waiting, praying for the small typing bubble to appear, for some sign that she wasn't completely alone. Nothing. A sharp breath escaped her lips, and for the first time, the reality of her situation settled into her bones with a crushing weight. They weren't going to help her. No one was. The same people who had once rallied around her, who had followed her lead in HOA meetings, who had supported her decisions without question, they had abandoned her the second she became a problem. Because that's what she was now. A problem. A stain on the community's pristine reputation. Her pulse spiked again as she turned away from the window, her body moving on instinct, pacing back and forth across her kitchen. She needed a plan. She needed control. There had to be a way to stop this, to shift the narrative back in her favor. She couldn't just lose everything. Not over this. But then, a knock at the door made her freeze. Her heart lurched into her throat as she turned, her body going rigid. She wasn't expecting anyone. And after the conversation with James, after being ignored by Lisa and Meredith, after seeing her own face on the news, the idea of who could be standing on her doorstep sent a fresh wave of panic through her. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob for a second too long before she finally pulled it open. And there she was. Olivia. Standing there, composed as ever, dressed in a tailored black coat, her expression unreadable behind those dark, calculating eyes. Karen's stomach twisted. The last time Olivia had stood in front of her, she had destroyed her. And now, she was back. Karen barely found her voice before Olivia spoke first, her tone even, measured, but laced with something almost lethal beneath the surface. "I figured we should have one final conversation before things escalate further." Karen's throat tightened. "There's nothing left to talk about," she said quickly, trying to keep her voice steady, but failing. I got your message loud and clear." Olivia tilted her head slightly, her lips pressing into the faintest hint of a smile, but it wasn't warm. It was the kind of smile that told Karen Olivia was in complete control, that she had already won, that there was no negotiating her way out of this. "Did you?" Olivia asked, stepping just inside the doorway, her presence commanding the space, making Karen instinctively step back. "Because from what I hear, you've been trying to fix this. Trying to reach out. Trying to salvage whatever scraps of your social standing you have left." She let the words hang in the air, her gaze sharp, studying Karen's face like she was enjoying watching her squirm. Karen swallowed, forcing down the overwhelming urge to slam the door in Olivia's face. "You don't have to do this," she said, her voice tight. "You've already what?" Olivia cut in, stepping closer, lowering her voice to something dangerously calm. "Already made you face the consequences of your own actions. Already taken away the power you never should have had in the first place." She scoffed lightly, shaking her head. "Karen, this was never about me ruining your life. You did that all on your own. I just made sure you didn't get away with it this time." Karen's fingers curled into fists at her sides. "So that's it? You're just here to rub it in? To gloat?" Olivia let out a soft, almost amused exhale. "No, Karen. I'm here to watch you finally understand what it feels like to be on the other side of things. To be the one who's doubted, who's ostracized, who's pushed out of the very world you thought you controlled." She took a small step forward, her voice dropping even lower. "And I want you to sit with that feeling for a while. Because the difference between you and me? I never needed this neighborhood to define me. But you? This was all you had. And now, it's gone." Karen felt something inside her break. Her throat burned, her vision blurred at the edges, the pressure in her chest becoming unbearable. She started, but the words caught in her throat. Because what could she say? What defense did she have left? None. Olivia held her gaze for another long, agonizing moment before stepping back toward the door, her posture effortlessly composed. Enjoy the next few days, Karen, she said smoothly, reaching for the handle. Because after this, you'll be nothing but a memory in this neighborhood. A warning for people like you who think they can act without consequence. And with that, Olivia walked out, leaving Karen standing there, in the middle of her once perfect home, surrounded by the remnants of a life that was already slipping through her fingers. For the first time in her life, Karen truly understood what it meant to be unwelcome. Karen stood in the center of her living room, her breath shallow, her fingers digging into the fabric of her sleeves as if holding on to something, anything, could stop the inevitable collapse of everything she had built. The silence in the house was suffocating, pressing down on her like a physical weight, an emptiness that stretched through every perfectly decorated room, every polished surface, every meaningless luxury she had once clung to as proof of her status. Now, none of it mattered. None of it could shield her from what was coming next. She moved without thinking, her body tense as she reached for her phone again, dialing Meredith's number this time, her fingers trembling slightly as she pressed the call button. It rang. And rang. And then, voicemail. Again. She swallowed, her throat tight, and tried Lisa once more. Same result. It was like she had been wiped from existence, like the people she had once surrounded herself with had collectively decided she no longer belonged among them. She was toxic now. Radioactive. And no one wanted to be caught in the fallout of her disgrace. Her hand clenched around the phone as she let out a sharp, uneven breath, her pulse hammering in her ears. She couldn't accept this. She couldn't just let it happen. There had to be something, some way to regain control, to shift the blame, to turn the narrative in her favor before it was too late. But even as she tried to convince herself of that, the truth clawed at the edges of her mind, whispering what she already knew. It was already too late. A knock at the door snapped her out of her spiraling thoughts, and for a split second, a surge of hope flickered inside her. Maybe it was Lisa. Maybe Meredith had changed her mind. Maybe someone, anyone, was here to tell her this was all just a temporary storm, that they would stand by her, help her clean up the mess, restore the order that had been so violently upended. She hurried to the door, straightening her posture, fixing her expression, smoothing down the edges of her panic before twisting the handle and pulling it open. But it wasn't Lisa. It wasn't Meredith. It was James Holloway. His sharp, calculating gaze met hers, unreadable behind the calm mask he always wore, his suit immaculate, his presence exuding the same quiet dominance he had wielded over this community for years. Karen's stomach turned cold. She stepped aside automatically as he walked in, his movements slow, deliberate, as if he was surveying the damage before making a decision. He took in the space, his gaze sweeping over the meticulously arranged furniture, the framed photographs, the curated perfection of a home that, up until a few days ago, had symbolized everything Karen stood for. Then he turned to her. "We need to talk," he said smoothly, his voice carrying none of the warmth she had once been so accustomed to when dealing with him. Karen forced herself to nod, her throat too tight to respond as she shut the door behind him. He didn't sit. He didn't offer her the illusion of comfort. He simply stood there, watching her, like he was measuring how much of a problem she still was, how much damage she could still do before she finally disappeared from the community's carefully polished existence. "You understand why I'm here, don't you?" he asked after a long pause, tilting his head slightly. Karen swallowed hard, her hands clasping together in front of her. "James, you need to sell," he interrupted, his voice even, uncompromising. Immediately. Karen felt her heart slam against her ribs, her vision narrowing slightly. "You can't just force me out," she said, her voice sharper than she intended. "This is my home. James exhaled slowly, as if her resistance was an inconvenience, an expected but ultimately futile reaction. Karen, you know how this works. You've been in this neighborhood long enough to understand that the association has the power to make things very difficult for you if you refuse to comply. He paused, letting the words sink in before continuing. And right now, every single homeowner in this community sees you as a liability. They don't want their names attached to yours. They don't want their property values affected by the scandal you've brought here. Karen's nails dug into her palms, her breath coming faster. A scandal that wasn't even my fault, she spat. This is ridiculous. This whole thing is being blown out of proportion. I made a mistake, fine. But that doesn't mean I should have to. It doesn't matter what you think is fair, James interrupted, his voice harder now. What matters is perception. And the perception is that you are no longer welcome here. The finality in his tone made something crack inside Karen, an invisible thread snapping under the weight of everything she had been trying to hold together. Her hands curled into fists. So what? You're just going to throw me out like I never meant anything to this place. James met her gaze, unflinching. That's exactly what's happening. Her breath hitched. Because deep down, she knew. She had seen this happen before. To other people, people who had made the wrong mistakes, who had gotten on the wrong side of the community's silent but absolute social rules. She had participated in it, in the quiet exile of those who had outlived their usefulness, who had become problems rather than assets. And now, it was happening to her. You have until the end of the month to put your house on the market, James continued, his voice returning to that unsettling calm. After that, the association will begin imposing fines for violation of community standards. And trust me, Karen, those fines will not stop. Her knees felt weak, the reality of her downfall settling in her bones like a slow, crushing weight. She looked at James, desperately searching for something, anything, in his face that might suggest this was negotiable. But there was nothing. No sympathy. No hesitation. Only decision. And in that moment, she understood exactly what Olivia had meant when she said Karen wouldn't belong here much longer. This wasn't just about punishment. This was about erasing her. Her lips trembled as she tried to find the right words, some last effort to cling to what little she had left. But James had already turned toward the door. This is over, Karen, he said without looking back. Accept it. And then he was gone. And the house, once a symbol of everything she had built, of the life she had controlled, felt like nothing more than an empty shell. A prison, closing in around her. Because there was no fighting this. No coming back from this. And for the first time in her life, Karen had to face the one thing she had spent years avoiding. Accountability. Karen stood in the doorway of her home, the place she had once ruled over with confidence, now reduced to nothing more than a symbol of her downfall. The house, with its grand chandeliers and polished floors, its carefully curated artwork and designer furniture, suddenly felt cold, hollow, like it no longer belonged to her. And in truth, it didn't. Not anymore. The walls, once a reflection of her status, now felt like they were closing in on her, suffocating her with the weight of what she had lost. The whispers, the judgment, the isolation, she could feel it all, pressing down on her, making it clear that her time here was over. Her house was on the market now, just as James Holloway had ordered. There was no fighting it. No more calls to Lisa or Meredith, no more desperate attempts to reclaim her place among the people who had already erased her. They had moved on, as if she had never existed, as if she was nothing more than a passing scandal, a cautionary tale whispered over wine at dinner parties. And maybe that's all she ever was. A placeholder. A figurehead. Someone who had wielded power only as long as it was convenient for everyone else. And the second she became a liability, they discarded her without hesitation. She had seen it happen to others. Now, it had happened to her. Her phone buzzed on the marble countertop, and for a fleeting second, hope surged inside her. Maybe someone had changed their mind. Maybe Lisa had finally responded, maybe Meredith was offering her some way out, some last-minute redemption. But as she glanced at the screen, her stomach twisted. It wasn't Lisa. It wasn't Meredith. It was her real estate agent. The message was short. Another showing scheduled for tomorrow. Another potential buyer coming to look at what used to be her life. She wanted to throw the phone across the room. Wanted to scream. But none of it would matter. There was no stopping this. The community had made its decision. She was leaving. Whether she wanted to or not. And the worst part? She deserved it. For the first time, she let herself admit it. She had spent years dictating who belonged and who didn't. Deciding who was welcome in this neighborhood and who wasn't. And now, the same judgment had been passed on her. It wasn't fair. It wasn't just. But it was exactly what she had done to others. And there was nothing more to say. Across town, in a sleek high-rise overlooking the city, Olivia Carter sat at her desk, at peace. The lawsuit had settled. A public apology had been issued. And more importantly, a clear message had been sent, not just to Karen, but to everyone like her, to every person who thought they could get away with weaponizing their privilege against people who had every right to exist in the same spaces. Not anymore. She leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly as she glanced at the framed headlines on the wall. Attorney Olivia Carter wins landmark discrimination case. Community enforces zero-tolerance policy against racial profiling. It wasn't just about her. It had never been just about her. It was about setting a precedent. About making it clear that these actions have consequences. That the days of sweeping discrimination under the rug, of making excuses, of offering empty apologies and moving on without accountability, were over. And Karen? She would never forget this lesson. She would never be able to rewrite what happened. She would never be able to erase the fact that she had tried to wield her power against the wrong person and lost everything in the process. And that? That was justice. But now, Olivia had other battles to fight. Because Karen was just one of many. And this fight was far from over. Because the truth is, for far too long, people like Karen have existed without ever having to face the real consequences of their actions. They have moved through life believing that their status, their privilege, their connections, would protect them from accountability. And for too long, that was true. But not anymore. Because people like Olivia are watching. The world is watching. And every time another Karen makes the mistake of believing they are untouchable, they will learn, some the hard way, that times have changed. So, let's talk about it. What did you think of this story? What would you have done in Olivia's place? Have you ever witnessed something like this happen in real life? Let's discuss in the comments. And if you believe in justice, in stories that expose the truth, make sure to subscribe to Tales of Twist for more. Because trust me, there are plenty more stories to tell.